In the depths of darkness, it's the quietest whispers that echo the loudest. Sometimes, true strength isn't in the power we wield, but in the silence we carry. It's not the blows we strike, but the peace we choose to hold. This is the story of a boy who didn't fight with fists, but with something far stronger, his mind. The prison gates closed behind him with a heavy, metallic thud. The newcomer, a young Chinese boy named Li Wei, stood motionless for a moment, taking in the harsh, oppressive atmosphere of the prison yard. He was small, barely 18, his frame wiry and unassuming. His black hair was cropped short, and his dark eyes held a quiet confidence, one that didn't match the surroundings. Li Wei had always been a quiet child, raised in a small village near the mountains. His parents had sent him to the city for a better future, but he had gotten tangled in the wrong crowd. A few wrong choices led him to this place, a stone fortress surrounded by the relentless winds of fate. The yard was filled with men, tough, hardened criminals from every corner of the world. Some were lounging, others were playing cards or talking in groups. The harsh sun beat down on them as they ignored the new arrival, sizing him up with silent judgment. The clink of chains echoed, mixing with the grunts of men lifting weights, and the occasional shout from a guard on the watchtower. Li Wei didn't flinch. He had been through worse. As he walked towards the intake area, a group of 10 men approached. They had been eyeing him since he stepped into the yard. Each one carried an air of dominance. There was Dante, the loudmouth from America, always boasting about his street fights. Jose, the Mexican with the tattoos that covered most of his body, his eyes always scanning for weakness. Sergei, the Russian giant with a reputation for breaking bones. Ahmed, the Middle Eastern man whose sharp eyes never missed a thing. And Vijay, the Indian with a sneer permanently etched across his face. The rest were a mix of ethnicities, some from Europe, some from Africa, each with their own past, and each wanting to prove their superiority over the newcomer. "Hey, Chinese boy," Dante's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You lost or something? This is our yard." He stepped forward, his chest puffed out. Li Wei didn't respond. His eyes remained calm, fixed on the ground ahead of him, as if he were simply walking through another day in the market back home. "What's the matter?" Jose sneered, stepping to the side of Dante. "Don't you know who we are? You'll pay respect, boy, or we'll show you why this is our yard." The others laughed, a deep, unsettling sound. Li Wei knew they were testing him. He had seen it before, in the alleyways of his childhood, men trying to provoke fear, trying to break a person before a fight even started. But he wasn't like the others. He wasn't here to prove anything. He simply wanted to survive. "Leave him be," Ahmed said, stepping forward with a dangerous glint in his eyes. "He's just a kid. Let's have some fun." Sergei cracked his knuckles, his voice booming. "Yeah. We'll teach him some respect." The 10 men surrounded Li Wei, but he didn't back down. He stood still, as if they were nothing more than wind blowing against a mountain. "Last chance," Dante said with a grin, looking around at his crew. "You'll learn your place, one way or another." Li Wei remained silent, but his mind was calm. He had been taught the art of patience, the art of stillness. Like the bamboo that bends but never breaks, he knew how to wait for the right moment. The group of bullies closed in tighter. They'd encircled Li Wei like wolves, their eyes filled with the hunger of men used to dominating others. They were testing the waters, each of them thinking the same thing. The boy was soft, just a kid who didn't know how to fight back. "Let's see if you can take a hit," Sergei muttered, rolling his shoulders in preparation. Li Wei could hear the taunts, feel their breath on his skin, but he didn't react. His hands were relaxed by his sides, his posture calm but alert. His mind drifted back to his training in the mountains, the endless hours of discipline, learning the flow of energy, the quiet strength that comes from mastering one's body. "You're asking for it, kid," Dante said, his voice mocking. "This is your last warning." Li Wei wasn't afraid. He had been through worse in his life, but more importantly, he understood the rhythm of violence. He could feel the pulse of the air around him, each movement, each intention. These men were predictable. They were bullies, not warriors. Josie took the first swing. He stepped forward, throwing a wild punch aimed at Li Wei's face, but Li Wei wasn't there. In an instant, he moved with the grace of a predator. His body shifted slightly to the side, avoiding the punch with ease. Without missing a beat, he grabbed Josie's wrist, twisted it with a sharp motion, and threw him to the ground. The group froze for a moment, stunned. "Get him!" Dante roared, his face turning red with rage. Vijay lunged next, his fist aimed straight for Li Wei's chest. But again, the boy was too quick. He ducked low, using Vijay's momentum against him, and sent him crashing face first into the dirt. The remaining bullies hesitated. They had never seen anything like this. They had expected fear, perhaps a struggle, but not this precision, not this calm, controlled power. Ahmed came next. His knife was out, flashing in the sunlight as he slashed towards Li Wei. The blade was quick, but so was Li Wei. He sidestepped effortlessly, his hand catching Ahmed's wrist before the blade could find its mark. In a swift motion, Li Wei twisted the arm and sent the knife clattering to the ground. He didn't stop there. He grabbed Ahmed by the shoulders and threw him into the dirt with a thud. "Enough," Sergey shouted, his voice laced with fury. "We'll make you regret this." The Russian charged at Li Wei with all the force of a freight train. He was big, his muscles rippling with brute strength, but Li Wei had the advantage of technique. Sergey's wide swing missed, and Li Wei's foot swept under the giant's legs, sending him crashing to the ground with a deafening thud. One by one, the bullies fell. Each move was calculated, each strike precise. It wasn't brute force that Li Wei relied on. It was his knowledge of balance, of momentum, of knowing where the enemy's weakness lay before they even knew it themselves. To him, this wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. The remaining prisoners stared in disbelief as their comrades lay groaning on the ground. Their faces, once full of cocky confidence, were now twisted in shock. "You," Dante gasped, struggling to get up. "You're not just a kid, are you?" Li Wei took a step back, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "Violence is a choice," he said quietly, "but not every fight is meant to be won with strength." He turned and began to walk away, leaving the men to lick their wounds. The prison yard, once filled with the sounds of jeers and threats, was now eerily quiet. The bullies had learned a hard lesson that day. Sometimes the most dangerous strength lies not in muscle, but in knowing when to move, when to stand still, and when to strike with precision. The next morning, as Li Wei entered the mess hall, the tension was palpable. The bullies had been subdued, but their pride had not yet been broken. They glared at him from across the room, nursing their bruises, but now they were more cautious. They had seen what he could do, and their arrogance had been replaced with wariness. "Stay away from him," someone muttered as Li Wei walked past. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. Li Wei didn't look up. He simply took his tray and sat at the far corner of the room, far from the stairs, far from the whispers. His focus was on the food before him, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in thought. Life in prison wasn't easy. It never was. He had been in and out of trouble before, but he had never seen anything like this. The primal desire to dominate, to instill fear, it was everywhere. The men in here were broken in different ways. Some had been hardened by violence, others by years of isolation, but they all wore their scars like trophies, like badges of honor. And yet, none of them had seen anything like Li Wei's calm determination. As days passed, the prison's atmosphere began to change. A subtle shift, nothing immediate, but noticeable. The bullies, though still proud, had become more reserved. The rest of the inmates began to whisper about the newcomer. They had seen the power in his movements, the confidence in his silence. The fights that once dominated the yard were now fewer, replaced by uneasy glances and whispered conversations. One day, as Li Wei was finishing his lunch, Vijay approached. His face was bruised, his pride shattered, but there was something different about the way he walked now. His arrogance had melted, replaced with something resembling respect. "You," Vijay said, standing awkwardly at the edge of the table. "I was wrong." His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Li Wei looked up, but didn't speak. His eyes were calm, almost unreadable. Vijay fidgeted with his hands, trying to find the words. "I've been in here a long time. I've seen men break before, seen them bend to the system, to the guards, to the fear. But you didn't break." He paused, eyes shifting nervously. I guess I wanted to know how you did it." Li Wei set his fork down, and wiped his mouth slowly, as though savoring the moment. "It's not about breaking, it's about knowing your limits." Vijay frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Limits?" "Yes," Li Wei continued, his voice steady. "We all have limits. The question isn't about pushing those limits, it's about understanding them. Knowing when to act, when to remain still. The moment you lose that balance, you lose everything." Vijay nodded slowly, as if processing the words. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I thought I had to fight to survive in here, but maybe I don't have to keep fighting." Li Wei gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Sometimes, the hardest thing is not to fight." There was something in those words, something that seemed to echo in the quiet corners of the room. Vijay didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, but not before giving Li Wei a look of silent gratitude, one that spoke volumes more than words ever could. By the end of the week, the yard had grown quieter. The bullies, once a constant source of chaos, now moved with more caution, their eyes downcast, their steps slower. They had learned something that couldn't be taught through violence alone. The others in the prison began to shift too, some seeking out Li Wei for advice, others simply watching from a distance, trying to understand what it was that made him different. Weeks passed, and Li Wei's reputation grew. It wasn't built on his victories. He'd taken down the bullies easily enough, but that wasn't the point. His reputation grew from something far more subtle: his stillness, his silence. It was in the way he moved through the prison, with a quiet strength that was as unshakable as the mountain that stood silently in the distance. It was in the way the men started to treat him, not with the fear one might have for a fighter, but with the respect one would show to a man who knew something they did not. It was during a routine evening in the yard that the moment of reckoning arrived. Li Wei was walking the perimeter, his mind still and centered. The others were scattered, doing what they did to pass the time, some in groups, some alone, but all with eyes that occasionally flickered his way. He had no interest in being a leader, in shaping others' paths, but like the still pond that reflects the stars, he couldn't help but influence those who stood near him. They had begun to ask questions, their curiosity like tiny pebbles dropped into the water, each one sending out a new wave. It was then that he heard a voice call out, harsh, mocking, "Hey, Li Wei." Li Wei turned slightly. Standing before him was Jamal, a towering figure whose arrogance had made him one of the worst offenders in the prison. He was surrounded by a group of men who had once been the prison's elite bullies. They were no longer the loudest in the yard, but Jamal still maintained his position. His pride hadn't softened. The wounds from his previous defeat, at Li Wei's hands, hadn't healed. He wasn't ready to accept what had happened to him. "You think you can change this place?" Jamal's voice boomed, echoing across the yard. His eyes burned with anger, but more than that, it was fear, a fear of losing control, a fear of being rendered insignificant. Li Wei didn't respond immediately. His posture remained relaxed, his gaze steady, as he watched Jamal and his crew. The tension was palpable, and the energy in the yard shifted, as though the entire prison was holding its breath. Jamal took a step forward. You've got a lot of men watching you. You've been quiet, too quiet. He sneered, his fists clenching and unclenching. Maybe you think that's power, but in here, if you don't fight, if you don't show strength, you're nothing. You're just another weakling waiting to be taken down. The group behind Jamal laughed, but there was an edge to their laughter. They were trying to mask their own nervousness, trying to convince themselves that Jamal was still the alpha. But Lai Wei knew better. He saw through the front. He spoke calmly. You think strength is in fighting, but fighting is the last resort. Real strength is knowing when not to fight, when to stand still, to not give in to what others expect of you. Jamal's face contorted with rage. Enough talk. He swung his arm out, aiming a hard punch at Li Wei's face. But Lai Wei was already prepared. He didn't move to dodge or block. It was something else. He stepped to the side, allowing the punch to miss completely. The movement was so fluid, so effortless, that Jamal's punch sailed past him without any resistance. In one smooth motion, Lai Wei reached out and grabbed Jamal's wrist. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. Jamal tried to twist his arm free, but it was futile. The more he struggled, the more he felt the pressure in his wrist, a subtle reminder of his own limitations. Li Wei didn't have to hurt him. His stillness, his control, was enough to make Jamal realize that his power was only an illusion. You don't have to do this, Lai Wei said, his voice low but resolute. Fighting won't make you stronger, it will only make you weaker. Jamal's face reddened. The group around him had stopped laughing. There was a palpable shift. The prison's most feared bully was now the one trapped in a grip he couldn't escape, by a man who didn't need to fight. For a long moment, Jamal didn't speak. He stood there, his pride crushed, his fists still clenched, but his body frozen. And then, something broke inside him. He released a deep breath and let his arm go limp. The fight had drained from him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He wasn't fighting. Li Wei let go of his wrist gently, his expression unchanged. He didn't want to humiliate him, only to show him. He didn't want to destroy him, only to free him from the lie he had been living. Jamal took a step back, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. What did you do to me? Lai Wei didn't answer. He simply turned away, walking back towards his corner of the yard. He wasn't interested in giving a speech, in being a savior. He had already said everything that needed to be said. As the men around Jamal began to murmur among themselves, the shift in the yard was palpable. Jamal wasn't the same man anymore. Neither was Sergei, and neither was Lai Wei. What had started as a fight for survival in a prison designed to break men had transformed into something entirely different. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about domination. It was about understanding, and in understanding, finding freedom. The true battle wasn't against others. It was against the fear inside, the fear that told you to fight, to win, to never stop proving your worth. Li Wei had already won. If this story moved you, don't leave without subscribing. Let us know where you're watching from and join the conversation. Your voice matters. Thanks for watching and see you next time.